But about whether the doctor should take the initiative and report the matter to the authorities now. I think a guiding principle will be the doctor is a member of the community. Shouldn't he report in appropriate cases a crime? But actually, you'd be surprised at the large number of crimes actually which come to the attention of a doctor, but which may not require reporting because there will be others who will take it up. The victim of the crime may be, willing to take it up. Somebody else may be willing to take it up. An employer may be willing to take it up. A friend may be willing to take it up. So why should the doctor think that it's part of his career to be spending a lot of time in the police station when he should be treating patients? So, but there can be situations, as I've said, where the doctor may have to take the initiative and report it to the police. Now, the public interest is something that the doctor must keep in mind. Let me give you the example of the epileptic airline pilot. Surely the doctor has to act in the interest of the public. If the patient refuses to cooperate and let the employer know, the doctor may see it necessary to inform the employer. Now, there should be no excessive disclosure. And just like in the law of defamation, the defense of qualified privilege can disappear if you engage in excessive communication. So similarly, when it comes to confidentiality, only to the appropriate person who has a need to know. So like in the case of an airline pilot, maybe there's an airline medical advisor, contact him. You see, disclosure between one medical person and another is usually easier to defend than say disclosure by a medical person to a non-medical person. So that there can be situations where I think a doctor has a duty to report, an ethical duty, I will say. And there was a case in New Zealand where a doctor reported to the police his patient had arsonist tendencies, despite his efforts to treat her and to get her to be admitted to a psychiatric hospital, and his advice to her not to engage in such behavior, she continued to do so. So he told the police. They kept a lookout, they kept her under surveillance, they caught her setting fire to a letterbox. She was arrested, she brought a complaint against the doctor. The medical council in New Zealand dismissed the complaint. By contrast, in another case, a cardiologist who was referred a patient to him by a general practitioner. Am I talking too much already? I'm going on now. No. Cardiologist reported to the Road Transport Board that a bus driver was not fit to drive. But the referring doctor, the GP who was assessing him, was of the opinion that he was fit to drive. The doctor only asked him, look, please clear him in the cardiological sense and give me back a report. That cardiologist got into trouble for making excessive disclosure. His duty was only to report back to the doctor, the GP who was attending to the matter, who had some experience in occupational health medicine. So the cardiologist went beyond the limit there. Right? So there can be situations. When it comes to Gillick, you may say, all right, doctor need not tell the parents when giving say contraceptive advice and treatment to a girl. But there was another case in UK where a doctor reported to the parents of an underage girl that she was receiving contraceptive advice and treatment. The doctor was taken to the medical council, but the medical council found him not guilty, that he was justified in informing the parents. So Gillick is not a license, but basically it's this: the doctor must exercise professional judgment, act in good faith when making disclosure.
Right. I'll keep it happily jurisprudential. Foolish to ask me such a question. I think essentially the duty of confidentiality, as Jira mentioned earlier, is really premised on the understanding that it protects the nature of the trust relationship between the doctor and the patient, that it frees the patient to tell the doctor things that might otherwise be kept secret if he thought that the doctor would reveal it. But like any privilege or any interest or any right that we have, you need to balance this right or this interest against perhaps a greater public interest. And so it depends, and so the limits of the law of confidentiality, I think, depend on where society wants to draw that line. When society decides that some things are too dangerous or the harm is too great, we cannot recognize, or we will not recognize this duty, and we require the doctor to report certain things. I think in terms of children, it's different because, you know, we give confidential, sorry, my English is gone. We respect the confidentiality of adults because we respect that they have a right to say things in a safe environment, and they are autonomous and they know the consequences of what they are doing and saying. But for children, you don't attach the same level of protection because they may not want to tell you, or they may not want you to tell anybody because they are afraid they might lose their parents, and because they are young, they are vulnerable, and therefore the law requires the doctor to report on a child. And that, I think that's why you don't require mandatory reporting for adults, for women who are victims of domestic violence, because you work on the assumption that as adults, as autonomous beings, they themselves should be able to draw these lines. Now that may or may not be true in fact, and I think that then becomes a matter of whether society feels to come out with it and they're being beaten back black and blue, then you can institute mandatory reporting. And a good example would be, as you said, gunshot wounds. I would suggest that when the first victim of a gunshot was brought to a hospital, there was no mandatory reporting because it wasn't seen as a threat to public interests. But as gunshot wounds became more common, as the dangers associated with using guns became something that the public was so uneasy about, then they were saying, well, you can't hide behind these things, so we're not going to allow you to hide behind confidentiality. So possibly someday, if you know, violence against women becomes something so urgent that needs to be addressed, then again the law, and again the law is driven by society, might come back to doctors and say, you have to report this particular thing, and you can't hide behind confidentiality anymore.
Thank you very much, panelists.
Fault and not needs. I just want to ask you, because logically, if a doctor is not in fault, then perhaps I'm a blood sample, but